Reprise du débat, l'honorable député de Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see you in that chair. I'm going to split my time with the member from Edmonton, or St. Albert, Edmonton. For 2 years, Canadians have been living with COVID-19 restrictions, 2 years of lockdowns, not being able to visit loved ones, not being able to travel, 2 years of isolation. And while Canadians understood the need for various restrictions applied during the pandemic, despite the lack of consistency, despite the mixed messaging, despite the confusion, Canadians have done what was asked of them. But what today they can no longer be expected to live with is the indefinite nature of these restrictions, the timelines, the lack of data. They are noticing that leaders across the country, 10 provinces, are following the evidence and advice from public health officials, evidence that supports ending the mandates. Mr. Speaker, provincial leaders have lifted or have plans to lift mandates in their provinces. The only government in Canada that has no plan to lift restrictions is this one. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that members opposite will argue that their compulsion for continued mandates is somehow justified by public health officials. But, Mr. Speaker, Canada's own top doctor says that the Omicron variant is a game changer and that it has forced us to rethink vaccine mandates. Dr. Tam said at we are at a very important juncture, and COVID-19 policies need to shift from emphasis on requirements to recommendations. That's the government's own advisor. The government's own advisor says that the federal vaccine mandates are under review now because the science tells us that the COVID-19 vaccine, or at least the first 2 doses, offers very little protection against transmission of the variant. Advice once valued by this government now suddenly ignored in an attempt to drive division and dehumanize those who don't agree, doubling down on a tactic that some members of their own caucus have called out. The travel vaccine mandate has prevented approximately 6 million Canadians from travel within Canada. It prevents them from flying out of Canada. They cannot travel, they can't visit family and friends, they can't take international vacations or even fly across the country. They can't live their ordinary lives. Canada is the only country in the developed world that bans citizens from air travel. And if you couple that with Dr. Tam's statements of reevaluating mandates, one can deduct that the rationale for a ban on air travel is no longer justified. But the government seems to have a different view, one that suits their political narrative. They may see travel as a luxury, but what about work or work across federally regulated industries? Let me tell you about one of those industries that's pleading for fairness, for common sense, for conditions in line with anywhere else in the world. In fact, even with their competitors in our own airports, the air travel industry. The Minister of Transport's mandate for vaccinations enforced through an interim order, or interim orders, I should say, were implemented swiftly across the industry. And despite being a matter of health and safety, employers developed and implemented that mandatory vaccination policy without consultation. La majorité des travailleurs du transport aérien se sont conformés aux politiques de l'employeur, tandis que les autres travailleurs ont été placés en congé non payé, sans avantages sociaux, sans accès aux bénéfices de santé. L'industrie a pleinement appuyé les efforts visant à assurer la sécurité des lieux de travail, des travailleurs et du public, comme l'ont fait tous les députés dans cette Chambre. Il est important de souligner la pénalité disproportionnée que les membres non vaccinés ont dû supporter. Ces travailleurs ont été mandatés pour travailler pendant cette pandémie et dans de nombreux cas, ils ont continué à travailler pendant la pandémie, contrairement à d'autres travailleurs dont les lieux de travail ont été fermés. Beaucoup pouvaient travailler à domicile. Ils transportaient le PPE vers les autres parties du monde. Ils gardaient les nécessités à flotte. Ils travaillaient eux-mêmes sans protection en matière de santé et de sécurité. In the travel sector, vaccinations ended up being the only tool employers relied on in the fight against COVID-19, and yet there are many tools to achieve the same goal. We know that. We've used it in other industries. We kept each other safe. Most were unimpeded by severe outbreaks. And at a time where employers are experiencing worker shortages, particularly in this industry, they're terminating experienced and seasoned workers. Employers and workers have the equal responsibilities to keep workplaces safe, and yet the failure to do so results in uneven and disproportionate consequences. For workers, the consequences of loss of employment, a well-paying unionized job with benefits and pension which impacts not just the individual but entire families. It's unlikely that these workers will find other employment that's unionized and stable, which will inevitably impact their family's standard of living. No one should lose their livelihood because of personal beliefs, particularly when alternatives to reach the same goal exist. The government knows that. We think workers who kept the industry flying during the most challenging times of the pandemic deserve better. By creating an end timeline and an end to this interim order and a path forward, the government can eliminate these employers' needs to terminate frontline workers we depended on, we celebrated during the height of this pandemic. They could do that today. Cases of the variant are receding in most parts of the country, and advocates for continued mandates are claiming the mantle of science to justify political positions instead of the evaluation of scientific findings that have turned up in each one of our provinces and across the globe. Just this week, a member of this House stood and offered masking advice to other members in this kind of contrived attempt to virtue signal superiority despite the clear rules in this place, based, of course, on expert evidence, presumably science, the same science that the government is relying on, and also worth noting, completely in line with what happens outside of the door of this place. That exchange suggests not only a disdain for those who follow the rules the member doesn't like, it creates an arbitrary standard on opinion masquerading as science, and that's exactly what we're hearing today. It's gross and it's purposeful, and in some respects it speaks to a continued deliberate attack on those who don't share the views of this government. We've seen that. And when Canadians see behavior like that, they lose their confidence in those who are responsible for public health decisions. The trust erodes. It suggests to them that the same disdain displayed for members extend to maybe people outside of this House. And perhaps it does, because in the absence of any data, benchmarks, timelines, plans to end these mandates, there really is nothing to suggest that continued mandates aren't just an opinion of this government. If it is, that's troubling. And if it's not, it requires an explanation that has not been shared, other than taking points delivered about science. Mr. Speaker, the intention of the mandates were predicated on increased vaccination rates. We have amongst the highest in the world. And when that narrative was no longer supported because of those high rates, the goalposts move. This week, it became about surgical backlogs, which is tragic and most certainly a capacity issue, but it's still inexplicable in relation to the continued federal mandate. And then it was simply a shoulder shrug from the Minister of Health stating COVID is still here, and of course it's still here. It will always likely be here. But I hope that that has not become the benchmark by which the determination of when to lift these mandates or when to drop these restrictions, I hope that's not the case. I hope it's not COVID zero that we're hearing from this government. Mr. Speaker, it's time to end these unjustified mandates, and I hope that members of this House realize that public experts, their own public experts, the government's own public experts, have said that it's safe. Provinces have said that it's safe. Public health officials have said that that is safe. I hope they agree with the Conservatives and lift the mandates so Canadians can get back to work and get their lives back.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire du leader du gouvernement.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's really quite abundantly clear when you read the motion and you listen to members from the Conservative Party that they have used their political science to make the determination that all federal mandates need to end today. Now, I don't know if they're feeling somewhat obligated because of their presence at the blockade protests, but I can suggest to you that it is highly irresponsible. And my question for the member is, does she not recognize that you cannot just wish the pandemic away, that there are and still is a need? In fact, take a look at what's happening in some of our provinces where there's greater concern in terms of other variants that are there. And I'm wondering if the member is prepared to say today that we have no pandemic. Like, why would she not at least have an open mind to what health experts are telling us?
L'honorable député de Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to remind the member that the National Immunization Task Force never called for vaccine mandates. The Public Health Agency of Canada never called for vaccine mandates. The Prime Minister himself, when gallivanting across the country during an election in the midst of this pandemic, said that he wouldn't impose vaccine mandates. You know when they imposed vaccine mandates? When it was politically expedient. So I'm not going to take lessons from the government on political science. That's exactly what they are practicing with this pandemic. That's exactly what we have seen for the last number of months, and it's a shame. It's a shame for Canadian workers that they turn their backs on.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Laurentides-Labelle.
Monsieur le Président, ma question est très simple. Bon, considérant ce qu'on entend depuis les derniers jours, ce qui vient de se mentionner aussi avec la santé publique au Québec et éminemment la 6e vague qui est en cours actuellement, je peux comprendre les cœurs en titre dont on parle, mais j'ai l'impression qu'on est ailleurs lorsque, présentement, on est en train de se dire « voici les solutions concrètes avec les transferts en santé pour faire face à une 6e vague ». Puis de l'autre côté, on se dit que oui, on va écouter nos gens parce qu'ils sont écœurés, donc on va leur permettre de se libérer davantage. J'essaie de comprendre, surtout que dans la proposition, on parle de « immédiatement ». Est-ce que ça peut être dans une perspective un peu plus à long terme?
L'honorable député de Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. It's not just Conservatives calling for this. It's public health officials. It's public health officials across 10 provinces that have already lifted their mandates. It's countries around the world where somebody who may not be vaccinated can get on an airplane. We're the only ones where that doesn't happen. So absolutely it should be immediate. In fact, it should have been yesterday. And we can talk about the 6th and the 7th and the 8th wave, but every single public health official, including Canada's chief public health officer, has said that it's time to live with this pandemic. It's time to give Canadians their lives back.
Questions et commentaires de façon virtuelle, l'honorable député de Yorkton-Melville.
Thank you, Speaker. I would like to bring to my colleagues' attention, it's a great speech, about a conversation on Ottawa radio station yesterday with an individual responsible for tracking the variants in the sewage treatment in Ottawa, and they've gone up. And he was asked about this, whether or not we should be doing what we're doing right now in lightening the mandates and giving people their lives back. And his comment was, it's not a problem that these are rising because immunity levels are rising at the same time. Wondering if she'd like to make a comment on that.
L'honorable député de Thornhill.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question, and certainly the gentleman on the radio is in line with public health officials, with Dr. Tam, with health officials across the 10 provinces who have lifted restrictions. At some point, we have to give, we've got to give Canadians their livelihoods back. We've got to stop being vindictive about the punishments of mandates, particularly if they are not justified and there is no scientific purpose to say that they reduce any kind of spread. There are people who are not working. There are people who have lost their livelihoods. There are people that have lost entire incomes for entire families, and they cannot return to work, and we ought to think about that.